Greetings fellow snowflakes. My previous video about social justice and where we're going wrong was based on a bunch of tweets I made yesterday, following some thoughts I've been having earlier that day. This led to my girlfriend chipping in with some insight she had on gender, which led me to having a bit of a think this morning and trying to get to a point of sanity on the issue of gender. So let me share my thoughts with you about this in what I'm going to call Gender Re-Examined. Let's start by saying that gender is partly social and partly biological in nature. Obviously, biological sex is biological, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I am talking about gender. Gender is not entirely biological in nature. That's a stupid argument to make. There are clearly aspects of gender that are entirely social and cultural, and we can tell this by looking at the different ways gender manifests in different cultures around the world and at different points in our own history. This is so clearly the case when it comes to ways that people dress and some of the more obviously stereotyped aspects of roles and behaviour. But gender also has a biological component. This is inevitable because we are primarily animals. Hormones affect mood and behaviour. Things like emotions and sexual libido are shaped by hormones in your body. It's not an exact science, of course, and there are plenty of variations, but there are trends and tendencies in those with more estrogen in their body or those with more testosterone in their body. And some of the conventional ideas we have about gender may be based on those differences and trends. It's also clear from the very complicated mating behaviours of some animals that gendered behaviour can also be affected by the biology of the brain. And there are certain biological components at play in the way the human animal may feel about their own body, the act of sex as it pertains to their body, and perhaps also to the style of mating behaviour they feel is appropriate for them. Sexuality is quite a complicated issue though, and obviously we would prefer to talk about preference for certain sexual partners, or a preference for being dominant or submissive in the bedroom as part of sexuality rather than gender. But when sexual desires and needs conflict with a person's actual biological anatomy, then that can be a sign that a person's gender identity is in conflict with their biological sex. Anyway, gender is partly social and partly biological. But even when it comes to the biological, anomalies and variations do occur. In a way, we talk about biological sex when we're referring to the physical anatomy of the person, their chromosomes, genitals, gonads, secondary sex characteristics and hormones. We talk of gender expression with regards to the purely social manifestations of gender, the appearance and stereotypes. And we talk of gender identity in that muddy area where the two interact, such as internalized sense of gender, congruence or dissonance with your own body, etc. Society structures itself around two gender categories, roughly based upon the biological sexes of male and female. Even the most socially and culturally specific manifestations of gender were historically based on the idea that those factors should be exhibited by people of a certain biological sex. So gender is very much based on sex, like it or not. Of course, these arbitrary social rules about gender are very unfair. To those who are comfortable being stereotypically masculine men or stereotypically feminine women, then great, but for others who might differ from the expected norm, the experience can be very painful and uncomfortable. Mostly, society is wised up to the need to loosen our expectations of gendered behaviour. Women can be assertive and protective, men can be nurturing and sensitive. We're even getting around to accepting that men can look pretty and feminine if they want, and women can be rugged and butch-looking if they wish. Cool, this is progress. But it's still true that gender as a concept is loosely based on biological sex, and society has two of these categories. Now, a person's inner sense of gender can also conflict with the gender category that corresponds with their biological sex. In fact, their brain can be conflicting with their body. This causes physical dysphoria and may also cause sexual dysfunction. What's more, physical dysphoria or not, A person may simply realise that they just cannot be happy existing in the gender category that society places them in. We do treat men and women differently. We interact with them and talk to them differently. It does feel different to be a man or to be a woman. This is still true as long as we make the distinction between men and women. And so there will be some who feel that their authentic nature is in conflict with the category that society places them in. And they will decide that they can never be happy, content or fulfilled in the gender assigned to them at birth, and that they need to transition. Maybe just socially, maybe also physically. Both options are valid. Yes, maybe if society was different, it would no longer be an issue for those who only need to socially transition. But it is unlikely we will ever live in such a society. Gender is based on biological sex and is partly related to biology, remember, and in any case, we do not live in it yet. It is cruel to insist that these people just get over themselves, suck it up and deal with their discomfort just to support the idea of a utopia that doesn't even exist yet. Why don't you get over yourselves and just let them live how they need to be in order to be happy? So now it's time to talk about gender identity with regards to non-binary individuals. I think, although society is currently structured around two genders, that it might be more practical and more compassionate in the future to have three gender categories. I think there needs to be the following choice: live as a man, live as a woman, or opt out of the system. There would then be a third social gender, the non-gendered. But how many genders are there really? Well, socially there are two, but there probably should be three. And because of this, all the different permutations of gender identity are really based on the two ingredients of male and female, or three if you want to include agender as a third ingredient. It really is an is black a colour issue. I've heard the opinion that there are only two genders, but that there are myriad forms of gender identity based on that. This is really a disagreement on words then, and not an actual disagreement in any real sense. Do we take in between, neither, both and fluid to be extra genders alongside man and woman? Or do we conclude that in between, neither, both and fluid are variations on the two genders of man and woman? This is semantics really, arguing over words rather than real issues. But I've done a complete 180 on this and concluded that the two genders with various permutations may actually be the more scientific and rational way of looking at this. If you isolate each permutation and designate it as a separate gender, then you very quickly fall into an infinite loop. If in between, neither, both and fluid are also genders, then maybe you'd conclude there are 6 genders. But then, what about being both a gender and a woman? What about being part way between man and the middle point? Every time you add an extra gender, there is a possibility of being that gender plus one or more of the other genders, a possibility of being in between that gender and one of the other genders, and a possibility of being fluid with regards to that gender and one or more of the other genders. It gets very silly, very quickly. But if we say that society has X amounts of genders, and that the way people identify and make sense of their gender can include variations and modifications of the above, suddenly we have a far more compact and scientific way of classifying the matter of gender identity. So say it with me. Society has 2 genders, but should probably have 3. As a result of this, the various manifestations of gender identity, which can include both, neither, in between and fluidity, are based on these 2 or 3 genders. Simple then, isn't it? Let's get back to sanity. Thanks for watching. We're all different. We're all special. Snowflakes unite.